Good morning to everybody present here, and especially our speaker, Dr. Shrimoy Ray Chaudhary. And I will just give a brief introduction before we begin. And I just want to thank everybody and our faculty for being here and starting this lecture series of Ijtihad. And I know these have been sort of grim times for everybody, and the whole country and all of us are going through a lot, but I hope this gives us something to ponder about, to think about, and to expand our historical imagination. And so Dr. Shrimoy Ray Chaudhary received his PhD from the Syracuse University before joining Shiv Nadar University. His research interests include imperial histories of medicine and law. His work seeks to bring together medical history and legal history, as well as oral testimonies and written archival records in conversation with each other. So he's presently revising his dissertation towards a book monograph which explores relations in British medical service, law and seva in British India in the late 18th and 19th century. Some of his publications include Toxic Matters, Medico-Legal Expertise and the Indian Positions Act of 1904, Crime History in Societies, Enclavist Networks, revisiting James Esdale's experiments with mesmerism-induced surgery at Haji Muhammad Mohsin Hospital, Corporation and Contestation, a fragmentary history of British Indian medical improvement 1819-1913. Thank you so much, sir, for being here and starting this lecture series with us in LSR. And I, on behalf of the editorial board of Ijtihad, I'm so glad that you could present and you could find this time. And I give it to you to start.
Thank you very much. I have the responsibility of talking about medicine and disease in times such as these. So I think I have an added responsibility in this case, not to make it too grim. So the work that I'm presenting today, let me first with you. Yes. Is it visible?
Yes. Yes.
So, just before I start, so just a second, stop sharing. I have to. So the work I present today is part of a monograph in progress, which engages with medical practices in relation to the history of services in the late 18th and 19th century Bengal. The Bengal Medical Service, which was founded in 1764, was disbanded as an independent service in 1896. The subordinate medical service was part of the Bengal Medical Service. Yes, is there a problem? No, I hope not. Sorry. The subordinate medical service was represented by the natives and formed the uncovenanted establishment. Accordingly, I locate the history of daktari or doctory in relation to the histories associated with these institutions, where service featured as a proper noun. I argued that the daktari's embeddedness in imperial history of service calls for a more rigorous exchange between official archives and vernacular print than what is mandated by the recent histories of vernacularization of medicine. It is noteworthy that the word daktari continues to this day to escape any particular nation-state's linguistic claim. Not only is the word widely used with varying intonations in the subcontinent, it is evident that daktari is a living expression of the erstwhile British imperial medical geography. Professor Robert C. Davidson, an MD at the University of California, prefers to call himself Daktari Bob in his accounts on the adventures in difficult terrains of Africa while training the native medical volunteers as part of humanitarian aid to Kenya. Daktari, a demotic usage that has survived independence from colonial rule in the subcontinent and Kenya, and elsewhere in British Empire is an agreed upon description of activities associated with medical service for species at large, from humans to animals. So the poster that I had shared with you, it's an advertisement of a popular American TV series titled Daktari, or Doctor in Swahili, which ran between 1966 and 1969 and was shot mostly in California. The protagonist was an American doctor who had come to reside with his family in a forest somewhere in Africa to initiate what they called, within quotes, affection training of humans for the wildlife. A telling portrayal of the legacy of civilizing mission today. Today, daktari as work or designation enjoys a wide currency in the context of global health. This is so because, as this TV series demonstrates, affection training go hand in hand with other more direct measures of rendering the wild, the terra nullius, visible as animal sanctuaries, as protected jurisdiction of private-public partnerships. While the Ayush Ministry in India seeks to undo the colonial legacy of keeping non-allopathic systems of medicine outside the field of general public utility, it too has recognized the value of the designation of Daktar in expanding the reach of neoliberal health reforms. What adds irony to government's preoccupation with the designation of Daktari is that it is also the preferred vocation of those who are officially designated as quacks, a dominant majority of unregistered practitioners, especially in rural India. Now, what does this approach involving the location of daktari within the genealogy of service as an imperial vocation entail? It requires of us to understand the shaping of medicine as an object of dispensation within the broader scope of colonial technologies of improving governance. I trace the vernacular translation of service according to the norms mandated for the native medical subordinates in and around the mid-19th century. I will present an overview of this field of translation by studying the modalities of knowledge production in Bengali. The two contexts which I have chosen to revisit are the dissemination of medical education in Bengali and, related to it, the formation of Campbell Medical School and Dhaka Medical School, and the corresponding institutionalization of medicine as an object of charity in the 19th century. Finally, I will analyze literary representations of daktari in the service of translation as chakri or naukri and as seva. The first section is titled The Problem of Economy. To this day, children in Bengal are introduced to Bengali literature through a primer written in 1931 by Rabindranath Tagore titled Shohoj Path, where children are introduced to the Daktar Babu in rural Bengal. The profile of Daktar Babu has changed. The moral of the story has not. Tagore depicts Dr. Viswambar Babu traveling 50 kilometers by a palki with his reliable bodyguard Raghu to treat the son of station master of Madhupur. In a journey marked by mishaps, Dr. Babu's party encounters the thugs at night. Raghu fights them off single-handedly by brandishing his lathi. Some of them fled, while 3 of them lay injured. Dr. Babu summons Raghu and asks him to bring him his medicine chest. Raghu asks, "Why, Dr. Babu?" Vishwambar Babu replies, "These 3 require daktari. We have to bandage their wound." The end of the story is appropriately optimistic. Morning has dawned, the sky shimmering in the first rays of sunlight, a new day has arrived. Tried and tested by the untamed landscape of the countryside, Vishwambar Babu is an embodiment of the nobility of medicine as a selfless service in the sense of seva. It is at the same time the personification of the reach of colonial state. Vishwambar Babu's journey to Madhupur, which is noteworthy that Vishwambar Babu's journey to Madhupur would not be undertaken in expectation of fees. Government officials in the rank of station master and his family were eligible for medical service in gratis from government-employed medical personnel like Vishwambar Babu. With the help of his bodyguard, Vishwambar Babu introduced the writ of the colonial state in the form of equity of justice by delivering both violence in self-defense and medicines to restore life. In this saga, there are no cops to seal the story in favor of the post-colonial nation state, no thanas to record FIRs. The doctor ensures a perfect harmony between life and death, retribution and reparation. However, removed from the romanticism of children's literature in official discourse, this unique equivalence between medical service, that is chakri, and seva, chakri means also nokri, or seva, personified by Bishambar Babu, was elusive to say the least, especially in such officially designated outlying areas of colonial medical geography, the countryside. Bishambar Babu's capabilities to insert the presence of the British state in officially designated outlying areas would have its share of ambivalence. For one, by 1880s, it became official policy to reserve assistant and sub-assistant surgeons for the subdivisional headquarters, leaving the native doctors or hospital assistants, as they came to be known, the lowest paid in subordinate medical service, to man charitable dispensaries in the countryside. Native doctors or hospital assistants were awarded vernacular licentiate diplomas in medicine and surgery, or they were also known as licentiates in medicine and surgery. Given the fact that students of the 3-year VLMS class, where Bengali was introduced to attract students in the Shialda Medical School, it actually was started in 1850s in the Calcutta Medical College itself as a special class for those studying in Bengali, and later it was transferred to the Shialda Medical School, which again came to be known as the Campbell Medical School from Lieutenant Governor Campbell. So the students of these schools far outstripped the medical graduates of the Calcutta Medical College 4-year degree program. Whereas the history of Britain remains testimony to a legislative distinction between the physician, the surgeon, and the apothecary over the 19th century. Here, this distinction was officially written not in the performance of daktari, but in the designation, compensation, and place of posting. Lesser paid VLMS diplomats, candidates carried the writ of the colonial state in the outlying areas as Dr. Babus. While opportunities were available for self-improvement and upgradation in service, it was found that only one had qualified examinations and received the rank of sub-assistant surgeon in 1901. For surgeon administrators entrusted with defining the scope of teaching medical sciences in Bengali, early reports of the Bengali class within medical college caused apprehension about the quality of medical personnel representing the government. While it was considered wasteful to teach Bengali medical students sciences like chemistry, which was part of the 4-year medical graduate course curriculum, de-skilling the standards of medical competence, it was argued, would make them unattractive against the Kavirajes, Hakims, and the lot that the British government classified as quacks. So in 1876, Dr. Bholanath Bose, one of the early graduates from England and civil surgeon of Faridpur in present-day Bangladesh, was asked to provide views on the desired qualifications and authority of the native medical personnel in the countryside. Dr. Bose pointed out that diseases of the poor in India did not range beyond, I quote, various forms of fever, principally of a malarious type, diarrhea, dysentery, cholera, and a few simple cutaneous disorders and abscesses and ulcers. Hence, no more than rudimentary medical education in the form of physic and surgery was necessary to train youth of good parentage and character, along with tested proficiency in vernaculars. The doctor insisted that for the writ of Sarkari Dawa to have effect, the native doctor would have to be authorized to act also as a law officer, entrusted with supervisory roles over various aspects of law and order. This particular suggestion was in line with the British government's own scheme of utilizing British officers of the Indian Medical Service as surgeon administrators in civil locations. While Dr. Bose's suggestion was discounted, his observation that minimum education was sufficient for the countryside found support from Lieutenant Governor General Campbell. Campbell set aside all apprehensions of devaluation of Western medicine and stated that the government preferred vernacular as a medium of diffusing medical knowledge among the poor in the countryside, not to produce highly qualified doctors. The knowledge of the native doctor should be sufficient enough to detract the people from visiting the Kavirajas and the quacks, and render English medicines, especially quinine, distributed by the government, more attractive. While native doctors or hospital assistants trained in vernacular were found to be the best fit, this debate raged from 1860s and 70s in search of a perfect resolution between what was deemed to be two incommensurate objects of colonial medical economy. the purportedly high value of medical sciences and the price associated with it on the one hand, and its present location as a charitable object for the poor. From around 1860s, the native doctors emerged as conduits between British civil surgeons stationed in the subdivisional headquarters and charitable dispensaries which were established through joint collaboration between zamindars and the government. To comprehend the bonds that drove Guptipara's Bishambar Babu to travel 50 kilometers to visit the station master's son at Madhupur, it is important to recognize the role of paper in training the in laying out the ropes of accountability for subordinate medical personnel. In order to understand the modalities of establishing the corporeal writ of the British state in India, we need to look as much on the social profiling of the population during vaccination as on the enduring role of paperwork to render the medical personnel obligatory to that writ. Periodic investigation of charitable dispensaries from 1860s ensured a regular production of body of knowledge that was as much interested in the nature of resistance put up by respective native communities during vaccination as it was about the general habits of the native doctor and his state of records. Later in the century, assistant surgeons would also report on the care taken by native doctors to label and differentiate poisons from drugs found in charitable dispensaries, stored in charitable dispensaries. The ushering in of Cinchona after 1857 demanded a systematic circulation that inspired localization of the agency of dispensation in permanent stations. So till now, the British government used to resort to mobile dispensaries in the form of temporary tents. This involved a more selective recruitment than offered by personnel who were recruited during epidemics and designated as compounders or locally appointed native doctors. So informal doctors. They could not be tikadars either. The tikadars were those who the state used for vaccination. So they were those who practiced variolation for smallpox, against smallpox, were often converted into tikadars for vaccination of tikadars of Jenner's vaccine. So these tikadars who the medical board had discovered at its own cost were hardly obliged to follow the clockwork disciplinary regimen of permanent charitable dispensaries. Medical, or what we would today call paramedical personnel educated in vernacular, were indispensable despite complaints of medical proficiency because they could be rendered accountable to the regime of paper. Paper documented the moral responsibility of the medical subordinates to the intense forms, rendering them answerable to the government on the conduct of circulation between medical ingredients, the charitable dispensary, and the population. Echoing Veena Das and Bhavani Raman's works, I would like to argue that while accountability to paper ensured legibility of native medical agency, it was layered in official anxieties of forgery, especially in the late 19th century, mirroring official apprehensions that charitable efforts of the government in circulating quinine remain vulnerable to the surreptitious workings of the bazaar, a frequently cited spatial reference for corruption, adulteration, and forgery. At the same time, the subordinate medical staff was brought to bear the weight of British Empire's legal writ by having them trained as medical expert witnesses in court to present medical evidence. Located between charitable object of medicine and the bazaar, daktari, as historians have observed, was rendered legible in vernacular medical print. Often medical manuals and journals like Chikitsak fed into the requirements of students in vernacular medical schools and early career practitioners. Medical manuals like Native Daktari Shiksha and Sahaj Daktari Shiksha, which translated the colonial writ by familiarizing the aspirant native doctor with steps to be followed by writing the prescription. Such manuals promise to assuage the anxieties of an amateur encountering prescription as an encrypted text where paper was both a source of command as well as a record of medical procedures undertaken by the practitioner. Government's insistence on teaching native subordinates the science of medical jurisprudence led Debendranath Ray, sub-assistant surgeon and teacher of medical jurisprudence and hygiene in the Campbell Medical School, to write a textbook in Bengali and name it Ayurved Vyavahar. Here, Vyavahar meant law and litigation. It was published in 1889, and so Ayurved in law and or Ayurved as law and litigation. In a text that was meant to inform students of Bengali medical classes of the principles of evidence detection as per medical science and their recording according to legal directives, Ray chose to include a section on anushan or fasting for the work of distinguishing the body of an ascetic from one committing suicide. Here, Ray cited his visceral experience of dead bodies under post-mortem when he was assigned for famine duties in Madras in the 1880s, where he distinguished those bodies bearing residues of random objects like leather, skins of tamarind, and baked food as famine-dictated fasting or incomplete fasting, as against the abdomen of the ascetic renouncer, which Ray argued would be dispossessed of any empirical sign of desire. Away from home on an official tour, Ray had found a way to order his everyday experience of famine death observations by transposing the cultural practice of fasting within a spatially imagined bounded geography onto scientific ordering of legal evidence. Ray's efforts at vernacularization of colonial medicine was consistent with the approaches of other such Bengali textbooks of medical jurisprudence between the late 19th and early 20th century. Titles preferred by authors of medical textbooks by teachers of Campbell and Dhaka Medical School, such as Vedic Vyavahar, Ayurved Vyavahar, Ayurved Vyavahar Vigyan, demonstrate a consistent effort to establish an organic connection between Shastric body of literature and concerns of litigation and state science. Indeed, native Dr. Sanyal argued that unlike Kaviraji, the practices of present-day Kavirajas and Veds, which had been maligned, so Kaviraji was denoted the practices of present-day Kavirajas and Veds, which had been maligned by the British government for its profiteering motives at the behest of social worth. Ayurved was a code that was portrayed as possessing universal value. The localization of daktari within the scope of Ayurvedic legal code was not, I argue, a means of identifying with the authentic as much as it was to establish a claim for modalities of governance which exceeded the bounds of legality of the British state. Vernacular in this case was the medium of rendering equivalent difference between the ruler and the ruled through textual acts of codifying laws of medical evidence for students of medical schools. The second section of this presentation deals with service as medical charity. The affinities between medicine patronized by the East India Company's government from the 1830s and agrarian revenue are stronger than is often acknowledged. Indeed, Haji Muhammad Mohsin's endowment for the Imambara in Hooghly was appropriated by the company in 1810, and one of the ways it endorsed the appropriation was by investing a part of the profit to build a hospital which was equipped to deal with surgical cases. Following the Charitable Endowment Act of 1860, the hospital found its official endorsement as a realm of piety that could be projected to be not only continuous to the desires of late Haji Mohsin, but also demonstrated that medicine was a fitting engagement for the improving zamindar. Echoing Henry Main's understanding of native customs as pre-contractual obligations, it was now insisted that as part of the traditional zamindari obligations, the present zamindars should be made responsible for dispensation of medicines, especially during epidemics. The institutionalization of medicine patronized by the government through charitable dispensaries in Bengal between 1860s and 1880s offers a glimpse into the emerging order of medicine as part of what Henry Lefebvre calls spatial framework of power. Before the onset of the Bardhaman fever in the 1870s, founding a charitable dispensary was left to the discretion of zamindars. Charitable dispensary was brought within the scope of government's financial regulations, by virtue of which zamindars were expected to commit part of their land and raise funds for securing the future of the charitable dispensary through a deposit to the government. This deposit formed the capital, which was to be invested in government bonds to accumulate in the form of interest. Amount of the deposit depended on the scale of dispensary preferred by the zamindar and deemed appropriate for the area and population. Following the Act of Local Self-Government in 1882, zamindars were released of their obligation to maintain the superintendent of chowkidars in their jurisdiction and instead were made responsible for the upkeep of charitable dispensaries. By 1880s, the charitable dispensaries had come to be officially deemed as institutions of general public utility, whose affairs could not be left only to the whims of zamindars. Donations from zamindars and well-off Europeans and natives near the location of charitable dispensary came to be deemed as evidence of public interest in medical charity. In the spirit of encouraging local self-government, Sergeant Payne's scheme advocated that all charitable dispensaries were to be deemed eligible for assistance from government in the form of half the salary of hospital assistants, which on joining was no more than rupees 25 at the close of the 19th century. Sub-assistant surgeons and assistant surgeons were to be reserved for to serve in more important administrative posts, and endowed dispensaries which had emerged out of EICs, that is East India Company's exclusive understanding with the few zamindars, like that of Uttarpara, would be they would be eligible for higher grade officers. By 1883, Inspector General of Civil Hospitals in Bengal could proudly declare that a series of standard forms showing regular manual working of charitable dispensaries had been formulated to enable the local administration to classify these institutions according to their resources, population, as well as oversee their conduct without being burdened by their day-to-day performance. The charitable dispensary scheme had registered a harmonious relationship between the object of charity and that of profit to enforce the conduct of modular zamindar as a public representative nurtured in administrative documentation. The classification of such dispensaries into 3 grades envisaged perfect approximation of charity, value of Western medicine, needs of the population through the lens of space. However, the public norms of private philanthropy laid out by the scheme found itself at crossroads with the purported intentions of zamindars, the main benefactors. Sergeant Payne argued that financial encouragement from the government towards local self-governance, defined within the scope of philanthropy, had to be watered down because official accounting had revealed zamindari disinterest in supporting public health. He reported that they revealed a peculiar situation where invested capital had accumulated and so had unutilized funds. While that would imply that medicines subsidized by the government, such as quinine, were not sufficiently circulated among the sick and poor. However, patient registers seem to suggest that the charitable dispensary was a popular one. This convinced Sergeant Payne that zamindars, in connivance with native doctors, had been fudging the records to benefit the families and amlas of their benefactors through the charitable dispensaries at the expense of the real sick and poor. This amounted to misuse of public funds and devalued the reputation of Western medicine during epidemics, which had been cited as a reason for closure of 17 out of 265 dispensaries in Bengal in 1878. The British Indian Association, which was an organization of the zamindars, did not refute the allegation that their amlas, that is, their those who representing mostly the literate classes, had access to the charitable dispensaries. However, the association argued, and I quote, "Now, these amlas, as a rule, receive small pittances, and they are not generally better off than the poor middle classes of the villages in which they may reside. Surely, poor and middle classes should not be deprived of charitable medicines because they constitute part of the middle class. It is notorious that they, who have generally fixed incomes, find it very difficult to provide for their necessities. Indeed, they are by no means better off than many an agriculturalist." The debate over what constituted an authentic demographic coupling of sick and poor did not yield any amicable resolution. British surgeon administrators were convinced that the pathology of counterfeit and faithlessness in the sanctity of writing was an inerasable sign of native mind, and the status quo on issues of improvement was the best the government could hope for. What was certain was that the fiction of public trusteeship envisaged in the form of medical philanthropy within the scheme of local self-government could not be separated from contestations that ensued over zamindari property, as well as between interests of charitable dispensary and those of commercial druggists within zamindari jurisdiction. Nor could the men employed by the government to man these dispensaries remain distant in these ongoing conflicts. Feuds over property between Jai Krishna and Raj Krishna Mukherjee, the zamindars of Uttarpara, betrayed the stakes that charitable dispensaries had come to acquire in the context of local representational politics in areas governed by municipal corporations. Caught between the obligations of service committed to medical relief as a charitable object, the attractions of remissions and commissions offered by the bazaar, and the exigencies of zamindari economy, daktari emerged as an iconic space for depicting the trials and tribulations of chakri in literary representations. Aratnath Gangopadhyay's novel Adrishta, written in 1892, was close to his own life as a native doctor in the countryside. It depicts these trials and tribulations of a locally appointed native doctor on his way to succeeding his patron in the charitable dispensary and finally getting united in a marital bond with his daughter, underscoring the circuitous and unpredictable manner in which one met one's destiny. In contrast, native doctor Surya Narayan Ghosh's Apurva Mala pays tribute in verse form to those who supported him on his way to becoming a native doctor, which, however, had not redeemed his problems. He admitted that his apprehensions about his recent posting at disease-infested Hazaribagh. Section 3, Daktari as Seva. In a recently published special issue on philanthropy in South Asian and modern Asian studies, the editor argues that anti-colonial nationalism stimulated practical transformations of indigenous charity into service or seva for the moral, cultural, and economic upliftment of the soon-to-be nation-states. In this concluding section, I would like to relocate seva outside the narrative of nationalism and see where it takes us. In the late 19th century, medical officials were forced to acknowledge that the symbolic location of colonial rule of law as one of difference between ruler and the ruled was not commensurate with the utilitarian demands of governance, especially medical governance. The presumed mandate of the government in representing institutions of general public utility rested on the fact that the government institutions did not discriminate on religious lines, that is, normatively. In the context of medical education, this presumed mandate ensured that only government institutions had legitimate access to bodies for dissection. In 1886, a body of doctors, Bengali doctors, established themselves as College of Physicians and Surgeons of Bengal and founded a medical school for imparting medical education in vernacular and awarding a 3-year licentiate diploma in the image of certificates offered by the government medical schools. It was now that the governing body, represented by R.J. Kaur, himself a prolific writer of Bengali medical textbooks, appealed to the government for arranging facilities for students to practice dissection. The committee set up by the government repeatedly discounted recognition of the Calcutta Medical School on grounds of not being sufficiently equipped to provide the quality of education demanded by scientific medicine. The petitions and appeals that followed from the governing body of the school demonstrated that the spectral figure of the sick and poor in the countryside, who periodically appeared in the image of ravages of cruel nature, emerged as the most powerful motive for justifying the need for dissemination of medical knowledge in vernacular in the countryside. What is evident from the exchanges was that governmental expertise, rather than government per se, was aspiring to locate itself as a neutral gaze in a contest over the scope of public health. Vernacular language was the magic wand which could render medical resources equivalent to the demands of poverty and abjection, or so it seemed. The governmental rationality demanded an equivalence between the teeming millions outside the scope of daktari and medical service and vernacular medical service. Official reports lamenting the state of government-run native medical schools, and on the other hand, invoking appreciative comments of doctors in service for the Calcutta Medical School, were widely cited to make a case for support from government. The excess of governmental rationality over colonial idioms of sovereignty was equally represented in a manner in which medical service came to be situated in relation to Dev Seva, or Seva of the preferred deity in the doctor's household. While in official discourse, daktari remained an ambivalent medical intervention in defining the scope of colonial medical space, Seva emerged as a site of modular representation of exchange in daktari. While journalistic representations of daktari in charitable dispensaries iconized doctors who sacrificed their time and labor in favor of reaching out to the sick, literary representations such as the anonymous daktar in the play Daktar Babu skeptically observed how the line between demands of seva and the lure of bazaar was reconciled by doctors offering charity in the morning and peddling intoxicants in the evening. Arashankar Bandyopadhyay's famous Bengali novel Arokoniketan, written in 1952, adds to the discursive promiscuity in Daktari's relationship with seva. The novel starts with a disclaimer that Arokoniketan was not a hospital or a charitable dispensary, two signature institutions we know of that represented public health and were designated as seva kendras, official. For Jivan Moshai, the protagonist of this novel, medicine was poetic babsha, or the vocation and enterprise he had inherited from his father. Arokoniketan was his home and his therapeutic center, the very village he had grown up. Back in the 19th century, when Jivan Moshai's father established and gained recognition for his practice, he could claim with satisfaction that his work promised equal exchange between the patron and the client. The client received cure and life, the latter received the virtue or punya intrinsic to seva, the surplus which is positioned prior to the exchange. Jivan Moshai committed himself to seeking out the remedies from Daktari and Kaviraji, serving the rules of medical charity and business in the name of his ancestors and his household deity, from whom he derived his authority to treat. However, Jivan Moshai's prognostications based on astrological knowledge, whose authority was founded on this very indices of seva, that is, personified by the deity and the ancestors. These very indices of seva were found at variance from the expectations of public health in the New India. Seva, after all, did not exempt the doctor from individual culpability before law. I would like to conclude by saying that even though Jivan Moshai dies in the novel, he seems to have had the last laugh. Today, GPS-driven government service of rural health failed to register the vast domain of unlicensed practitioners, estimated to be 2.5 million, who dot the long distances between the village and the suburb to access government primary health units and town hospitals. Apart from underscoring the ambivalent location of daktari in relation to law in the rural and semi-urban areas of India, it also demonstrates the productive life of daktari's association with seva. Even as we speak, the colonial legacy haunts present-day administrative solutions to quackery by seeking ways of incorporating them as social practitioners, I quote, without the medical designation. This is so because practitioners with degrees from Ayush Ministry have been found to prefer urban areas over rural India, thus leaving the gap between medical service and population intact. As players in the neoliberal economy take stock of legal difficulties of guaranteeing the play of market forces in public health in rural India, I leave us to reflect on the political ramifications of the association between daktari and seva in late 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this insightful lecture and helping us locate the evolution of medical service, particularly at a time when the importance of doctors are more than ever. Thank you so much.